Being with us. As with most interviews, it's easiest when you're genuinely curious about the topic. And so all of these are my questions. um,
That's wonderful. Thank you for having me. This is so exciting.
so can you start by telling us about Naheyawin, just open-ended?
Yeah, absolutely. So Naheyawin was started by myself and my younger brother, actually. We started back in 2016. Basically, I have had a bit of a history in entrepreneurship and technology. I've always been interested in building businesses, solving problems, social innovation, that kind of stuff. And my brother is actually a trained actor. So he loves connecting with people, storytelling. And we kind of got to this point in our early careers where we're just like, we can continue going on in our, our given trajectories and probably experience a good bit of success. Hunter was already performing in New York and Toronto, and I was, traveling and working and doing the digital nomad thing. So I'd already achieved kind of my long-term goals, like 2022, 23. And so, we basically had this long conversation watching actually lawn bowling, funny enough. And then just basically had this conversation about, like, what actual impact do we want to have in our communities? We've always been interested in our culture and have seen the value, for our own lives of, how Indigenous ways of knowing and being can really help us lead more intentional, more meaningful, more impactful lives. And, could we share that in some way? So we kind of started the business with that. It wasn't even really a business plan in any way. We didn't really have an idea of exactly how we'd make things work. So we just kind of started. And, it was a whole lot of, as I'm sure many business owners know, a whole lot of just saying yes to everything until you kind of are driven bonkers enough that you start saying no. And then over time, we started niching down into kind of what we're doing today, which is, I think at the core of it, and Michael gave a really good summary, is Naheyawin is really about how do we make treaty, and we are all treaty people. Everyone who lives in these territories is a treaty person. We're all beneficiaries of the peace and friendship treaties. How can that relationship, how can those principles and ideas actually enable us to move forward in a way that is Canadian, actually, fundamentally. It's not kind of, European and transplanted here. It's not American, and we're kind of anxious about our neighbors to the south, and that's how we're defining our identity. But actually, from a relationship with these lands, with the original peoples of these lands, and really being able to realize that future in a way that is coherent with those initial kind of values and beliefs. And it's been incredibly rewarding. We've been able to work with a lot of really wonderful organizations in our city, but also nationally and internationally. And we've found a really interesting niche that we've been working in, especially recently because of everything that's happening, in our kind of social consciousness with arts, with our storytellers. And again, you can see probably some of the alignment there. And and I guess as a little bit of a side thing, Naheyawin, we also actually we produced a play. Not last year, but the year before with the Fringe. We co-produced a play called Lake of the Strangers, which I wrote and Hunter acted in. It was just kind of like a fun thing, or that was the idea. Turned out to be a lot of work, and my respect for those in the arts just continues to grow, which I didn't think was possible. But so yeah, and we had a lot of fun with that, and that was again very much in line with this idea of storytelling, of imagining our future, of imagining ourselves as mythic in a way. We can talk about that later if you're interested in that. So so that's a little bit about Naheyawin. It's a bit, it's very, Hunter and I refer to it as sometimes, it feels like a bit of a clown car. Like it's a small little entity, and we fit a whole lot in it. So yeah.
Sure. Well, yeah, I want to touch on all of that. I mean, you've touched on, bringing Indigenous practices, Indigenous knowledge as a way to solve problems. And you've also touched on creativity there. And when I look at not just you, but your advisors, there's so much creativity behind what it is that you're doing. And so can you help us understand how both of those things are helping you to solve problems in a really unique way for your clients?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I think you need to kind of actually step all the way back to, what is the difference? Like when I say Indigenous ways of knowing and being, what I'm talking about are Indigenous worldviews. And I think a lot of people kind of, can recognize those words, like separately, but perhaps all together it gets a bit confusing. So the way that Hunter and I usually explain to it in workshop settings is that, worldviews is basically, it comes from a German word that I can't pronounce, but it basically means, the way in which you actually, the perspective that you see the world that from. And it really influences kind of how you think about everything. What problems are problems actually in the first place? What, you know, what are our values that we approach those with? What is our end goal? And like, you know, kind of what are the base values that we're approaching the world with? So, you know, when we're looking at the difference between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, there's a pretty fundamental gap that I think kind of, you know, produces the culture gap that I think some of us actually forget is there, which is perspective of the land. So the word Indigenous comes from the Latin indigena, which means to spring from the land or sprung from the land. And that was a term that was actually chosen by globally, it was chosen by groups of Indigenous peoples globally. It was the first kind of like, you know, global political identity that was chosen as an endonym, so what we call ourselves, that we use to kind of identify ourselves. So it's supposed to be a bit of a layering piece. You know, you're Indigenous, but underneath you're also, or on top of, depending on how you see things. You know, I'm Sagoe Inawak, so I'm Woodland Cree, or Naheyawin, so that's Cree as well. So yeah, so like when you're seeing this word Indigenous, you see again that really deep connection to the land, and that not that you know, we should take care of the land. I think a lot of people have that, you know, probably that misconception that Indigenous peoples are just like really into, you know, land stewardship, but actually even more fundamentally that we are connected to the land. They're inextricable, that we are connected to the land, and then because of that connection to the land, we are all connected to one another. So when you think about it in that context, and actually even through time, that there is no, you know, difference between us now and the importance of us now, as, you know, compared to the importance of people yet to come, or as well as people in the past. So when you approach the world from that kind of perspective, you start to see kind of everything as interconnected, as everything is, you know, really systemically interlinked, and that everything is valuable. And you start to get these really interesting kind of principles that you can start to actually use in day-to-day life. So, you know, a really simple one that Hunter and I use all the time, which I think, again, many of us are familiar with, but perhaps not on the kind of deeper level, which is this idea of the talking circle. So, you know, I think everybody understands that kind of idea of, you know, the importance of sitting in circle, and, you know, so we can see each other and so we can listen to one another, and there's no like, you know, one person in the front, you know, kind of speaking to the rest of us. So, you know, the way that we explain it is, you know, imagine there is a tree in the center of the circle, and let's say, you know, those of us on this conversation right now are around this tree, and we have this tree in the center, and I describe, you know, from my place in the circle, this is what I see of this tree. It's, you know, there are these branches here. There's, I think, a squirrel has hidden some nuts in there. I can kind of see the outlines. And, you know, let's say, Jody, that you're directly to my left, and, you know, you describe what you see from your place. And because we're so close to each other, we basically see the same things, right? But as we start to get around to, you know, to where Mike is, all of a sudden, you know, Mike is describing something completely different. And, you know, from if you don't understand that we're all sitting around in a circle describing the same thing, you might think like, oh, we're actually in conflict. Our viewpoints are in conflict. We're describing different things, as opposed to we're all actually, you know, collectively defining the truth in the middle, that the truth is all contained in that tree in the center. And by the time you go around, you know, everybody has to go through that process of trust and description and providing perspective. And then by the time it gets back to me, through that process, if we've all engaged with it fully, we've developed this really multi-dimensional understanding of this object in the center. And I think it's really obvious from a, you know, a physical object in the center how that works, but we can place things in there like, you know, ideas, technologies, and then we can kind of go around and say like, this is what I see from my place in the circle. And if we, again, come from that perspective that, you know, we are all connected, you know, our perspectives all matter just as much as everyone else's, you start to, again, gain those types of core teachings. And, you know, from there, you can then once again build on top of that technology with even further kind of abstractions and applications of that idea. So that's where you start to get into, you know, building on top of the circle, because that works with a group. But what about between groups? And that's where you can see where, you know, ideas like treaty really come from. So, you know, these types of tools are really what we bring to businesses, really kind of explaining that these tools are for everyone to use, that are treaty people, especially if we properly attribute, you know, kind of, you know, where they come from, truly understand them, and also understand that we are all trying to build a future that we're all excited to meet. I think right now, like, we've all really defined a kind of, you know, a present and past that we're not proud of or happy to exist within. But if we can understand that, you know, each of us have a responsibility to take care of one another, but also in our work, build a better future, I think that, and it's actually been, quite successful in showing people that, everyone's work and everyone's time and everyone's care and everyone's listening is truly valuable and does make real change. Because if everybody were to do that process, I think we could move pretty quickly together. So yeah, so I mean, you start to see again all these tools and how they can be applied, and public engagement sessions, and how that can really, provide some really interesting structures and ways of framing questions and conversations. And yeah, it's really fun.
Yeah, I bet. So, how has 2020 shaped the work that you're doing now? We've had a few months to pivot. It's been a wild year. Um, what has that been like for Naheyawin?
Oh, it was really tough. I mean, it actually kind of continues to be tough. We've been on this really interesting kind of roller coaster. So, rewind to, I guess, mid-March for most people. I feel like I probably should have this date burned into my memory because of how like awful it was. But I think it was that kind of day that everyone was like, between the NHL shutting down and the schools closing, I think it got real for everyone.
Hmm.
So, so this idea that, basically wake up in the morning and then like, certain contracts are getting canceled with like organizations that are directly tied to, airlines and kind of city operations and, kind of things that where they had bigger fish to fry. We were just like, absolutely. I feel bad you're even emailing me. Like, I feel like I should have emailed you and said, don't worry. But then also, all of our kind of in-person workshops just kind of, wiped, all in kind of a couple of days. And like, as managing director, Hunter is a director of story. It was kind of my job to fill our schedules. And so, on a personal note, it was really tough to kind of see, the fruits of like months and months and months of work and, coordination kind of all just wiped away. I think at heart, I'm a total stoic. So, kind of stoicism, Marcus Aurelius kind of stuff. So I tried to really walk through that in a thoughtful way. But it was really hard. And so, kind of took the weekend to kind of, just be like, what does this all mean? And sometimes yelling, what does this all mean? And just, and just trying to, figure out what our next move is going to be. And, very luckily I love technology. So it was quite easy for me to be able to be like, okay, like let's start to bring stuff online. So, we had actually already kind of begun, some development of online versions of our courses that are gamified and on gamified platforms. So people can really interact with that material. Because it was getting to the place where, we'd found such a great kind of formula about like how we actually get people from, third grade social studies, like 20 years ago to, being kind of able to, interact in conversations with people and have interesting conversations about Indigenous awareness, state of our relations today. So because we come up with that kind of recipe, it was, Hunter and me being in a room was the real kind of limiting factor. So it was kind of a natural thing that we already start moving that direction of gamified and kind of, that kind of thing. So we had already basically finished it by the time that that COVID broke. So that was very lucky. We had already been doing that work. So that wasn't too much of an issue, but really starting to lean into marketing and actually, getting our course out there was really important. And just trying to socialize, honestly, the idea that a lot of the work that we do today at Naheyawin, that it can be done online. And that was something that we've been trying to figure out for several years, just to be like, we don't actually need to physically be in the room to be able to make the changes and work with people that, that we need to kind of, collaborate with. So, so that was interesting. But so bringing a lot of our, turning a lot of our kind of in-person lunch and learn seminars into webinars, which we actually found to be really neat, and how it's been able to kind of open up avenues for people outside of Edmonton and Alberta to more national kind of conversations and kind of more niche conversations too that I'm really excited to engage in and see how our ideas kind of match that kind of sector. So yeah, so that was really important. And then, honestly, like Indigenous peoples are incredibly active on social media and, generally are pretty good users of technology. So what we'd always thought that we could do public engagements actually really effectively, especially province-wide, using our computers and Zoom and, and even just phone calls. We've been able to actually really, lean into that and be able to use those tools to kind of have those conversations with community members. So, and that took, I feel like that took probably 2 or 3 months to really like fully get in order. It was stressful during that time, but like, Right out of the gate after COVID hit, we kind of got ourselves very busy, and we conducted just a really kind of brief, engagement around, how is COVID actually affecting Indigenous artists and cultural workers. And so we just started to hold these kind of really informal kind of talking circles using, Zoom and other platforms, and just doing surveys. And we actually got a lot of information. And it was really, I think it was a real happy accident that seeing that everyone was in this really kind of kind of troubled position, kind of fearful about the future, bummed about that all of their work they've been putting into was wiped clean, a lot of them. So there's this kind of sense of community building, and I think that really helped us kind of really narrow our focus for the work that we want to do moving forward, just being like really like approaching groups and even volunteering in some spaces, just being like, how do we help build community in this time, which just got more important with the murder of George Floyd and all the subsequent kind of ramifications of that, and how many different communities have been thrown into disarray and really kind of deep reflection. And the tools that we can come to, that we come to these groups with to offer, which is really very much based in generosity and kindness and the importance of relationships, it really resonates. So since that point, and I've been kind of dividing up the pandemic, the experience of a pandemic, kind of before kind of everything that happened in the States, and how that's all kind of reverberated around the world before that, and then after that. And then after that, everybody is just kind of we kind of shuffled down the list in terms of priority of what we do at Naheyawin, diversity and inclusion, in the initial outbreak, which we were just like totally. But then, kind of once all of these issues started to become a lot more more obviously salient, more obviously important, all of a sudden, like, we're busier before before the pandemic actually begun now. So, and honestly too, like, it's this real sense of, kind of harkening back to the reason we started Naheyawin, to make that impact, to make that change, to feel like, we're doing our own, in our own small way, trying to help make the world a bit of a better place, by the time that we're done our time here on Earth. Like, this is totally that work. So in a lot of ways, it's been this very, again, a roller coaster, like I said at the beginning, a very bittersweet, very interesting kind of way to see the world. And it just kind of, again, opened up some really interesting opportunities for next year and the subsequent year, because we were actually supposed to be touring our play, Lake of the Strangers, on a European tour in May.
Wow.
So obviously that didn't happen. So, but now that we're starting to plan it again, now we're just like, oh, actually, there's now that we have more time to plan, so we've gotten very good at the silver lining, finding that and really trying to build that. So, a lot's happened. It's crazy that it's been, I mean, like, how many months has it been? Not even like 3.5, something like that at this point.
I can really keep track. It's not many.
It's bonkers. So yeah, so that's, I guess, in a very like circuitous kind of path, kind of what the experiences has been for us.
So you've touched a bit on purpose there, and I wonder if you can elaborate on that, because you do have this magical patchwork of things that you're working on. How would you distill it back to some purpose that drives you?
I think it kind of, I don't know. I try to always live by this like adage that, like, be who you needed when you were younger. And I feel like that's probably what drives me the most in general. Growing up in, like, Southwest Edmonton, being, often the only Indigenous person in the room, growing up in school and feeling, kind of, alienated and kind of on the outskirts. Not just of, kind of, mainstream culture, but also within our own communities, because our own communities have been struggling with enforced patriarchy that have kind of, dug their claws into our communities for like hundreds of years now, which isn't, like the patriarchy that's present in our communities isn't, a part of, traditional ways of being. It's just kind of, found its way in there, as it does in many colonized communities. But, so you feel a sense of alienation when, at school, sometimes, even when you're trying to engage with culture in our own community as well. And then on top of that, being a total tech nerd, I just keep like kind of layering things on of just like all the different ways that I kind of felt, like a weirdo and like on the outside. And, I guess up till now, it's kind of been this journey of being like, okay, like, well, I guess I have some work to do to make sure that, I, as an Indigenous woman, am visible when, in the work that I do, even though honestly, like, I joke not joke that, you know, anytime you see me in person or doing these types of conversations, you know, that I've been pulled kicking and screaming from, you know, from my room. But in a way, it kind of feels like that. It's not a natural kind of setting for me, but I feel a sense of obligation to be able to do that way. You know, other, you know, potentially, you know, young Indigenous girls growing up right now can see me and be like, okay, that means I can do that. And that would have meant the world to me. So I think purpose for me really goes back to that. I think, you know, if I can speak on behalf of my brother, which I do, because he's my younger brother, so I have that right, is, you know, he and I we really love, we really think that there's, you know, we as Canadians are totally sitting on this kind of like undiscovered gold mine in a lot of ways for a lot of people, that we don't realize just how interesting of a journey we could be on right now. If we were to really kind of look down and look around us and see kind of like what's beneath our feet and all of the tools and the, you know, the massive history that we have. I mean, you know, we'll just, you know, even just speak specifically about Edmonton. Like Edmonton is, you know, internationally known as the cradle of civilization in North America. You know, it was, you know, this kind of joining place of two ice sheets, and you know, and there were people have been meeting here for thousands and thousands of years. And so, you know, we have this very deep history in this place, and people don't know it. And I think why that's important is not just so we can, you know, feel like kind of like, you know, high and mighty when we go to like Paris, but so that we can really, you know, I think that if we have a reverence and a love for where we live, we act differently, we walk a little bit lighter. And that's incredibly important, not just for, you know, literally treating the land in a better way, but also treating each other with a little bit more care, because we're all on these lands together. We all are sharing this together. So, you know, Hunter and I, we really think that kind of sharing those stories is so important, which is why, you know, the next play that we're writing and the stories that we're writing are very much, you know, they're all centered in Alberta and these places over time. And really kind of like showing this amazing history that we have here. And I mean, there's even like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which is a really important document internationally for Indigenous people's rights. An enormous part of that was done like by people from and led by people from like Alberta, from, you know, Musqueam, from Edmonton. You know, the 1969, the red paper, and you know, that whole movement in the 60s, late 60s and 70s, it was all led by people out of Edmonton. And like, people don't know there's a building down by the old, you know, municipal airport where all of that really important work was done. And so I don't know, I feel like for both of us, it's very much like we're total word nerds, and I can explain that, you know, a little bit later as well. But when we look at certain words like recognize, when you look at the etymology of that word and see what it's actually made up of, it means to see again, to find what was already there, to see what is already there again. And that's kind of what we feel like we do, is that kind of like helping people recognize that they are powerful, that our communities are powerful, that we have a really exciting opportunity here as contemporary peoples to kind of do things right, or at least begin that journey in a good way. And so purpose definitely it really comes down to those kind of core ideas of, you know, being who I needed when I was younger, of, you know, trying to practice being as brave as you can, even though I don't think anybody ever feels ready to do what they need to do and what is actually right. And yeah, and really try to help people recognize, you know, what's already there.
So I have this suspicion that anyone, even if they weren't familiar with what an Indigenous-based engagement session might have felt like before, they're starting to get a sense of just how very experiential and sort of tangible that is. It is a different sort of experience, and it tends to come with a lot of like very physical cues and like in-person cues. So what does Indigenous-based engagement feel like now for those who haven't experienced yet in the COVID age?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, we're kind of inventing that as we go. So, you know, this is kind of this is our hypothesis at this stage. But it kind of for us is really just highlighted how important the preparation is. So the great thing is that, you know, if we can actually engage a much wider variety of people, because we are having things remotely done. So, you know, for example, we've done a couple engagements where we actually have, you know, we can see people and they're muted, but their kids are just like running around screaming in the background, you know, that wouldn't be able to come to a session, you know, if finding childcare is challenging, you know, getting to the place is challenging. So we've actually been able to get some really interesting perspectives in the room that we haven't been able to. But that does, you know, prove its own challenges as well, as you were saying. So rightfully, you know, being able to kind of, you know, get a sense of people's, you know, like body language, you know, get a sense of when people are also getting tired, because the whole room just kind of starts to sag when people are getting tired and need a break. So, you know, we can't read that obviously online, but I think it's actually kind of forced us to be really, really nailing the preparation for these sessions. So, you know, being very careful to, you know, kind of prepare people when we invite them, be really intentional about who we select to actually engage in these conversations, having a conversation even beforehand to be like, this is what we're going to be talking about, and here's why. You know, here, maybe if we even have the questions already developed, here are the questions, people can think about them ahead of time. And yeah, and then in sessions, actually just trying to keep them really as you know, kind of tight as we can. Still doing a prayer, we find to be really successful, really helpful in intention setting, and again, kind of touching again on why are we here? Where is this information going to go? You know, what to do as well, you know, after the session if people need to kind of check in, or you know, they want to add something that they can get to talk about during our sessions. So having that being really clear and explicitly said is very helpful. And then you know, honestly, leaning heavily on the circle. You know, even though we're not in the same room, we'll still kind of sit in circle and still talk and still kind of go one at a time, really let everybody feel like they can speak and that they'll be heard. And yeah, and breaks have been really helpful too. And then also, one thing that we've been finding, especially recently, has been really effective is actually providing some kind of teaching or a story as kind of a primer at the beginning of our sessions. One that we find to be really helpful is the kind of a bit of a teaching around the Tura Wampum, which is was the kind of one of the earliest treaties between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada. And you know, I don't want to get too much into it, but basically the earliest agreements that were made were following Indigenous law. And again, I'm totally out of my canoe on this one, but the idea of one of the core tenets of Indigenous law and what makes it different is that it actually builds on each other over time. So the agreement that was made, the Tura Wampum, the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch in 1613, those core tenets in that agreement is actually present in all subsequent treaties, the spirit and intent of all subsequent treaties. So, you know, our Treaty 6 has roots in that original, that grandfather treaty. Lots of people refer to it as. So, so we basically introduced this Tura Wampum treaty, explained some of the messaging behind it, explained this idea that, you know, the belt kind of lays out in very stark terms the relationship that they wanted to have at that time between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples of, you know, two vessels going down the river of life together. You know, they don't, you know, the vessels, you know, try not to bump into each other, but we still try to remain in relationship. And that doesn't mean people can't go between them. And in fact, it's important that people go between them in order to maintain those relationships. But we also need to understand that they are different, because if anybody's ever tried to walk around in a canoe like you do in a ship, you know, it's not a good time. So, you know, we need to be able to have that conversation to understand differences. And that, you know, we need to maintain that relationship in the middle, but also that we need to maintain our relationships in our own vessels as well. And so that presenting that teaching and then saying, okay, what we're here to talk about is, I don't know, like mental health. You know, what needs to be done, you know, in the ship, in our kind of, you know, predominantly white institutions, kind of those types of institutions. What will we say needs to be taken care of in that vessel? What do you think must be done in the kind of middle? How can we maintain this ethical space in the center? But then also, you know, in our own canoe as our Indigenous communities, what must we do to maintain and rebuild and revitalize our own systems and our own communities as well? And so presenting that kind of information, it really helps people just have like a, you know, quite a wide and honest conversation. And again, it's all rooted in kind of Indigenous ideas instead of just, you know, kind of doing a bit of a question and answer kind of questionnaire type thing, like kind of focus group setting. So it's really leaning into the new kind of, you know, the new tools that we have, seeing the kind of limitations. Yeah, because you can't hold a 3-hour conversation on Zoom, like an hour, 90 minutes, and then people are just like, I need to leave. So, so that kind of stuff. So it's a mixture of practical and then, but also you can play YouTube videos in, you know, in Zoom, and like, you know, you can do that kind of stuff. So you can, it's good. And then breaks are like 5 minutes. So people need to go to the bathroom because it's usually not that far. So there's a lot of stuff that you can do. But yeah, it's, again, it does very much go back to the preparation. We're finding that we're spending way more time in prep than we would have before. Which, you know, will probably improve our in-person sessions once we can do those again.
Sure, yeah, it's, sharpening the tool set. So what are the conversations like with your clients? I mean, you mentioned that, in March, people were panicked. There were a lot of things that were pressing, and you were having contracts, canceled or put on hold. But now you're to a point where you're busier. So I'm curious how that has evolved and what actually is happening in those conversations with the clients that you're serving.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's kind of it's this very strange tension. I think right now with a lot of organizations, which is the kind of like we're in basically this economic kind of like crisis. We're in this public health crisis, but like it seems like almost everyone has this real, and maybe it's because it's the only thing we have control over. But we're really kind of focused on, okay, when things come back to normal, do we actually want things to go back to normal, or is this an interesting opportunity for us to rethink what normal is and actually make it so that we go back to some sense of normalcy, that it's actually better, or at least on the road to being better. And so there's, it's actually where we thought we might be, which is kind of being like, kind of persuading people like this is important for you to, to kind of consider and work on, especially while, we're kind of in this great pause. We can actually, people are actually kind of pulling us into the organizations to be like, we really want to do better. I think there's this kind of a sense of urgency on the part of a lot of organizations to be like, we really want to change. Crises like this tend to reveal underlying crises, and that's what I think that's what a lot of us have been seeing. And it's really, I don't know, I feel like it's this like really wonderful moment, at least for me on just kind of philosophical level, to be like, wow, like humans under enormous stress are looking at like how we can kind of improve some of our systems and really kind of see how these systems were not working very well beforehand, and how can we make those better. So a lot of the conversations we've been having are, of course, I find that there's more of a constraints around budgets, but honestly, people are they're a lot more open to kind of kind of like a little more out there ideas, because I think people are very willing to like be like, okay, like if that's what you think we should do, let's do that. So that's been really cool. But I mean, constraints around budgets, but honestly, because we can do more interesting things that sometimes just take less time as well, it ends up not being too much of a problem. And then, honestly, it just there's a real sense of really wanting to, spring into some kind of action. So a lot of the time we're trying to reel people back a little bit and be like, okay, like let's just look at the next 6 months, and then we'll revisit in another 6 months and think like, what do you actually want to do at that point? Because the last thing that we want to do, and we constantly talk about this, is like sustainability. Sustainability is like critical, especially at this time. If people really heavily lean into this work right now, and then let's say we're all, something else happens, oh my God, touch wood, in a couple months time, we don't want people, all the work that we've been doing for the last couple months to kind of like fall off because we hit that, the kind of bump in the road, a new bump in the road. We really want to make sure that everything that, these organizations are engaging with feel authentic. They feel specific to them. It's not a checklist that they're doing in order to not get called out, on Twitter or something, but that it's like important and core to all these organizations. So, and people are really eager to do that. I think because a lot of the messaging right now that people are getting is very much around, a lot of people are getting is, how do we take up as little space as possible? Sometimes these organizations, how do we kind of shrink down, if these are organizations that are predominantly white, and the institution is, a lot of the kind of core people, the institutional memory is predominantly from this kind of, settler background, but that's okay. But again, the two-row wampum idea, it's okay for the ship to be there. We just need to figure out how to put that ethical space back in the middle and ensure that our Indigenous peoples have that space in their own vessel and the resources available in their own vessel, in that canoe, to be able to revitalize our own systems as well. And it's just kind of expanding, the kind of, what people are laser focused on right now to, let's remember we're on this really long journey together, and that we can't, really tire ourselves out.
Yeah, great point. So, what was I going to ask you? So, so many things. So I mean, how are companies finding you right now, and what do you think is driving them to you? Like, is it a lot of sort of reputation building, referrals? Have things changed? Because, you mentioned the murder of George Floyd, and we're seeing a real I think, an exciting momentum around conversations around anti-racism. But what are you seeing about how that looks, especially here in Canada and from your business?
Yeah. So, I mean, I heard this really wonderful quote. It was from one of my friends and he quoted somebody else. But anyways, the quote was, when somebody's like, like drowning in a river, you don't try to sell them a life jacket. Like you make sure you bring them, you save them, you bring them to the side, and then you're just like, you might want to consider this in the future. So like, that's kind of been how we've been thinking about our business is like, if we see that certain people are struggling, kind of doing more kind of, honestly free work than we have been doing in the past, literally to just help people when they're in this kind of like a tenuous spot. Not everyone like hires us after, but honestly, given our, the type of work that we do, like I'm totally cool with that. So yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of that, a lot of kind of, just conversations about people just being like, can we just go for a walk and like kind of pick your brain? This is what we're struggling with. We're just like, absolutely. And that kind of thing. So really coming from that place of, kind of believing that idea of abundance, that like, there is enough to go around, some kind of patience, a little bit of working more than we, honestly would like. I feel like most people are divided up into, either have very little to do, or, are just being like overrun with the amount of work that they have to do now. So yeah, that's hugely present. But yeah, I would say, kind of word of mouth. If we've been doing a lot of workshops that are open to like kind of associations. So if we're already doing a workshop with organizations, we're just like, invite other people in your circles if you want. Like it doesn't, Zoom has a lot of room. So, feel free to invite other people if you want to. And then we found that we've been able to get in front of some really great people that way. Yeah. And just, kind of, I don't know, just trying to be as available as possible and help other people where we can. And try to, always try to do our best work. And it sounds so fucking silly to say, but this idea that like, we need to really show up and just do, just kind of offer what we can, how we can, and let that kind of, just kind of sit there and let growth happen from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've touched on a few of the like workshops that you offer. I noticed that you have a lunch and learn called Staying Warm, a guide to allyship in action. And I'm guessing that's a topic that you're getting a lot of questions on as people are sort of waking up in the COVID era. There's a lot going on in the world and maybe we all have more time to think about our place in it. What are some of the things that you advise for folks who want to be an ally?
Yeah. So I mean, like that seminar is kind of the most popular one right now. You totally hit the nail on the head there. So I mean, they're very. I mean, like the title of it, "Staying Warm." It comes from a teaching that we got from our Muslim actually, who was saying like, hey, you have to remember that no matter what you do, it has to have that symbolic flame, that warmth at the middle of whatever you do. That has to be at the center of your action. Otherwise, everything that you do is cold, and it won't work. And we've really taken that to heart ourselves, and have really operated from that place, and have gotten a lot of kind of positive feedback from bringing that forward. So yeah, so I mean, a lot of the teachings and kind of the tools that we provided in that workshop are very much around that idea of like, not just how do you be an ally, but also how do you stay warm as an ally. Right now it's super warm right now in Edmonton, so it's it doesn't resonate, I think, as much perhaps because it already is warm. But this idea that it's tough out there. I think that we're all aware of kind of call out culture, of cancel culture, and like how difficult it can be to actually get in that arena and help, because you are placing yourself in harm's way, and for good reason. I think that we all understand that there's good reasons for that. But we need to kind of name that, name things like lateral violence, name things what people are doing when they feel, the walking wounded, the kind of, the child that is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth, like that kind of idea. How can we have that compassion while at the same time being able to, still do the work that needs to be done? So a lot of the tools are around, kind of compassion, how to exercise compassion, how to make sure that when we are, that when anybody is doing that work, they understand that it, again, that sustainability is being at the core of that as well. And that also that the work that people are doing as allies, that they are, that it's coherent with who they are as a person or an organization. Again, so that, in the 201 idea that, you are a part of that story. Like, it can't just be you're going out and fixing things that aren't necessarily, closely tied to who you are and the journey that you're on. But yeah, but that, you are part of that journey as well, but that you also look at the, that, your perspective isn't the only perspective in the circle. So those types of ideas have been really, really helpful. And just reminding people that we are on this very long journey. We are on a journey of 7 generations at the very least, as many of our elders tell us, and that we need to be patient. The work that we want to do is worthy. It's also very difficult and it will take a long time. So what can we do if we were packing for a journey of 175 years, we would pack differently than if we thought we were going on a journey for 2. So, how can we make sure that we remind people of that? So that's really what that workshop is about. And I think it's a lot of the feedback that we get from that session is that it's a sense of like hope and kind of like a breath of relief for a lot of people, because there is a pathway out. There are tools that we have that can help us get through this tricky time, people to get through their own struggles in this moment as well. We just need to kind of be able to use them and practice them.
Right. So you've touched on so many of the concepts that I think, clearly apply to who you are and how you operate in the world, but also who Naheyawin is, talking in circle, the concept of abundance, the importance of sustainability. Are there other things that, you think are really unique about the way that you apply that sort of worldview to the way that you operate your business and sort of?
Yeah, I think there's one that's actually really critically important. I think a lot of people forget it, which is a sense of play and fun, which is a sense of humor, and like really making sure that like we remember that like underneath all of this old stuff, we are still kids, and that we do still need to make sure that we're taking care of those young ones that are still in us. So I think that, kind of bringing, and we get into this a little bit with storytelling, but the idea of, like laughing, our elders have told us that like, laughter, it brings us closer to the spirit world. That's a sacred thing. So like, bringing in humor. I think if, anyone listening has ever sat in, and hung out with Indigenous peoples, typically, especially Cree people, not to toot my own horn, but, how funny it is, how many jokes there are, how many funny stories there are. And how often, we kind of have to, make fun of each other and make fun of ourselves, and how critical that is. Because I think we take ourselves so seriously, and, being able to kind of bring people out of that, I think is really, really important. And I think that helps that, Hunter and I are, in our 20s, and, we're kind of, it feels so natural to us still to kind of be able to bring those into specific spaces. We haven't been, professionaled out yet of our humor quite yet. So being able to bring that in has been really, really important. So that would be a really critical one. How do we make sure that we bring in play? And it helps that Hunter trained as an improv artist as well. So he loves improv theater, and try to bring those games in too.
Oh, I'm sure. Well, I mean, if I can let my own preferences spill here, I would love if COVID lets us keep some humanity and some humor in the workplace. I think that's
Yep.
something that a lot of people would point to as one of the improvements of sort of the workplace in 2020. Are there other things that you really hope will change for the better for the long term out of what we're experiencing right now? A whole bunch of seismic shifts?
I think so. I mean, like, again, you'll see, the kind of technology part of me jump out here, but like, I'm really fascinated by how, like our economic systems and our monetary systems are being stressed in this moment, and about how it could like open up possibilities for really considering in a serious way universal basic income, of utilizing things like cryptocurrencies to help us avoid, or at least kind of ameliorate the effects of quantitative easing in our money market. So that kind of stuff is really exciting to me, especially as an Indigenous person. And the reason that is because, I mean, there's a reason that we as Canadians don't use the British pound. Like, sovereignty is closely tied to our own monetary systems. So the fact that Indigenous peoples don't have their own currencies is an important facet of sovereignty. So being able to look at cryptocurrencies as potentially a solution is very interesting to me. Yeah, and then just, I don't know, I think the way that we think about our cities is going to really change. I know that for me, I've been a total downtown dweller for a very long time, and now I'm looking at people, that have backyards and a little bit, they're, they can open their window and it's not super loud. I just find like my stress levels are just so much higher and kind of a regular basis now. So being able to kind of value getting out in the quiet, I think will be really interesting. And then because of, technologies, we might be able to do more kind of, video meetings or, remote working. So that'll really, I think, change how we think about the future of work, which I've always been interested in and always kind of seen as like, that's exciting. That's probably in 10 or 20 years though. I think we just hit the fast forward button there. So those are really interesting pieces for me for sure. Yeah, and then honestly, with so Lake of the Strangers, our play, we were, as I mentioned before, we were going to be taking that on tour, and then now we're actually starting to work on the show, putting it onto film. Because obviously we can't get people, we can't get people into a theater right now, and probably not for at least a solid few months. So being able to think about, okay, like, maybe this could actually be a bit of a forcing function in a direction of like truly innovating in theater and not replacing, but how can we, kind of bring those experiences and not just setting up a camera in front of a stage, but how can we really kind of expand the experience of the theater into the digital realm? So it's kind of a full-fledged response to kind of theater purists about being like, but what if something crazy like this happens? When really it is actually addressing other problems too. Like when we did our show, we had people from, up north, from our family, from our nation, not be able to travel to come see our show in Edmonton. So, there is accessibility issues there too. So I think there's so many different ways that the world will change, I think, for the better. And hopefully that happens. I think it was Naomi Klein. She gave this like really wonderful presentation near the beginning of the outbreak, talking about how, in moments like these are, we tend to pick up what we have lying around. And those are the things that end up surviving these types of moments. So I really hope that the stuff that we pick up that have been lying around are kind of better ways of treating each other, of trying to, think about everyone and, various needs, and really think about, kind of more crazy stuff like cryptocurrencies and sovereignty and these ideas that are critical. So those are, it's going to be an interesting few years. A part of me thinks we're in the darkest timeline, but a part of me is just like, maybe this is just, a bit of a crunch time and we'll kind of burst out the other end in this really cool way.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Are there any in-person elements of your work right now?
We do a couple. We've been doing a couple outdoor ceremonies. So we are working with a couple clients who are doing, construction projects. So we can still do the kind of like, the grounds blessing ceremonies and those types of things. But we've been, and then like outdoor gatherings, for some, especially meeting with elders who, potentially don't have, as solid an internet connection, but those kind of things. So, we've been looking at doing more kind of like outdoorsy type stuff, like, like tours or like walking tours or workshops out on the land. And so we're definitely exploring those. So lots of opportunity, lots of interesting things to look at. And hopefully we keep innovating.
So how does innovation hit you and Hunter? Like I'm trying to imagine how all of these vast ideas ever become reality for you, because it sounds like there's a lot cooking in your brains and in your operation.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we love our work. So honestly, we tried to implement like a no talking about work like outside of, work hours, in because we actually also like share an apartment. So like again, this seemed like a brilliant idea like pre-COVID, and like now all of a sudden we can't go to our office, can't go anywhere. We're just in our apartments, and so we tried to instill that kind of no talking about work at home. But like we love it so much that it's actually like anytime we go on a walk, like making dinner or whatever, we're just so excited to talk about, oh, this person suggested this, we saw this happening and, that this other company was doing. What if that worked for us? Like, how could we kind of, be inspired by that work? So those are the main things for sure. So it's, I don't know, it definitely hits us in a very kind of, in excitement. And then I kind of have to figure out how to actually make it happen. So, but luckily, again, I'm a total nerd and I love working on this stuff.
That's great. So you touched on the fact that, I mean, it's probably more true now than ever. There are people who are probably struggling for things to do, and then there are people who are really overworked. For those who are on the struggling end, what are some of the things that are sparking excitement for you? Like, what would you recommend that they follow or read or watch or listen um, to get back some of the excitement that you clearly have for the world right now?
Absolutely. I mean, so my kind of like first love was film. So I've been watching a lot of especially foreign films because I can't travel, which is very sad. So being able to do kind of more kind of work through the backlog of all the foreign films like on the Criterion collection that I haven't been able to get to has been really, really wonderful. I know again, it's kind of like I can't tell the difference between like, by looking at someone, like who is somebody that hasn't written a word since the beginning of the pandemic versus somebody who's like has like 6 ideas for different stories they want to tell and like has completely rethought how they want to like participate in, their artistic practice. And so it's tough to say, but I think for Hunter and I, especially in crafting our new show that we're working on, again, kind of imagining very similar to the idea earlier of, what story do I wish that I could be told right now? And trying to develop that story, like how would I kind of comfort myself if I could somehow bring a story out of nowhere to do that in this moment. And it's of course we started writing this kind of teenager coming of story 13,000 years ago story, so how it is. But so I think creative practices are really valuable. Where you're actually kind of creating something, be that, again, writing or music or, gardening. And then, yeah, those are important things. But I mean, like if you follow smartly on Twitter, you can have some really cool, look into some really neat conversations that are happening. I follow some really excellent kind of people in Indigenous Twitter that are really having some neat conversations around, what the pathways forward are. In a really kind of tangible way. And then, emerging technologies, like, a lot of those, spaces haven't really stopped and have only become more important. Studied biology in university, so of course, following all of the innovations that are happening in healthcare has been really fascinating. So I don't know. I mean, like, I'd like, pull on a thread, see what you think is interesting, follow that thread and see kind of where it goes. And, try to find some beautiful things, I think is really important as well.
Well, I'm sure you've inspired some folks with that encouragement. We're sort of close to wrapping up, so I want to wrap up by asking. You've talked about so many things that I think speak to making meaningful connections, and I think it's tougher for many folks, especially who are struggling to adapt. What let's say what are your 3 practical tips for those who are still trying to make meaningful connections right now when the world is not what it was 6 months ago?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Oh man. Let me think. I think that's a really, really good one. I mean, like I've been finding just anything that you can do to help yourself kind of stimulate divergent thinking to be really helpful. So like I mean, something as simple as kind of going on a walk in an area you haven't gone on. The kind of like, physical practice of actually like movement, but also just being out in, kind of what do they call it? Green bathing. That kind of idea. Yeah, yeah. So you can help your brain kind of also just kind of get out of just, staring at a screen all day. Because I know that's a lot of people's days today. Is like 90% is looking there. So I think that's really valuable. I think, kind of imagining if you were, going to be starting a new business right now, or starting a new kind of effort right now, that's, just kind of starting as if, you're not losing anything. Because I think that's where some people get stuck, is this kind of like, and I say this out of experience, is this kind of, frustration that like you've lost something, and everybody has lost things. But like, how can you kind of, if you hadn't lost anything, you're starting right now, how would you operate that? And kind of having that bit of a thought experiment. And then, I don't know, I'm a total introvert, so I feel like this is always going to be a struggle for me. I don't know if it is with everyone else too. But just, trying to have as many kind of video calls, as many kind of conversations with friends as possible. Even people that you don't even know super well too. I found it just kind of reaching out to people that I'm like, this person was interesting and I didn't get to take them on a coffee, but like, why not, kind of have a conversation now has been really valuable. And just, kind of reach out in any way that you can. So I think that those things would be the kind of practical tips at this point. And if I were to sneak in a fourth, it would be to really value that kind of self-care. I do, at least in myself and in other people that I really care about. I don't think enough people are really giving themselves the kind of leeway that they would a dear friend navigating through this time. So, you know, kind of treating yourself again with that old kind of, you know, that old guideline to kind of treat yourself as if you were treating, you know, a dear friend. So, you know, let yourself be not productive. Let yourself, you know, kind of have a bad day. Let yourself kind of, you know, take a nap at 2 in the afternoon and try again. And so those would be those tips for sure.
Those are great. Honestly, it's been so much beautiful sharing. I really appreciate it. You know, I appreciate Mike for hosting, getting us all coordinated today. It's been so fun to learn about you and what your experience has been like. And I'm just grateful to have learned a bit more today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. This is so great.
Yeah.